Many of you have probably been here and seen Peter's presentations in the past, and it's always fascinating, and I have no idea what he's up to today exactly, but it's going to be good. So.
Well, you might not know about it, but your work is in it, because Corey lent a big hand in this effort, as did Max and Jeff here as well. And I thought this might be a good opportunity to also thank you for everything you guys have done.
It's been fun as usual, so
let's have some more fun.
Go for it.
All right. Do we know where the lights are in here? Oh, here they are. They're behind me. Let's see what combination of turning off lights works best. Well,
that's as good as it gets.
That's as good as it gets, huh? No kidding. Although,
trust me, I've tried.
That doesn't work either.
Fiddled every knob.
Oh well. Hopefully you guys will all be able to see this clearly enough. All right, so I'm here to give a presentation today that's really probably the most meaningful one that I've given here. Not to say that the other ones weren't meaningful to me either, but this one's really meaningful to me because, as I'll show you in a moment, it has its genesis in a tip that was given to me after my presentation last time. I followed that tip, and it led me to what you're going to see today. Okay, so this literally grew out of a conversation that took place after my last presentation here last October. So Mexico Personified, the rise and fall of a native avatar. I'm going to explore the roots of the banknote vignette that I addressed in my last presentation. Previously, I analyzed the ethnic and political symbolism behind the engraving of the native woman seated atop an Aztec throne on the 1 peso note of the Banco Minero that circulated from 1888 to 1914. Now, I examine a similar motif, a personification of Mexico as an indigenous woman, all right, seated atop a pedestal that adorned coins, medals, and artwork in the years before and after independence. So here's the banknote from last time. There's the vignette. It's the primary vignette on the note, front left, full scale. As you may remember, I said it basically represents Mexico revived after the Maximilian occupation, and she's put here also to signal mestizo national identity in Mexico. Here, of course, is the image we'll be looking at today, also a primary image, front and full scale, in this case on a proclamation medal from San Luis Potosí from 1828. And we'll unpack her in a little more detail. All right, so let's take a closer look at that figure. The earlier figure on coins and medals is distinguished by a suite of features, all or most of which are present in its various versions or incarnations. She's seated atop a pedestal. She's wearing an embroidered gown that we call a huipil. Right? It's a very specific kind of native gown. She wears a feathered crown on her head, carries a bow and quiver full of arrows on her back. All right, very warrior-like. She also brandishes an Aztec sword, a macuahuitl, in her left hand. She has a cornucopia at her feet, a nopal, very Mexican cactus, on her left, and many times an arrow in her right hand. We know it's an arrow because on the coin version, it's actually fletched, okay? And then atop the arrow is the Phrygian cap of liberty as well. So here you see the image dissected with all those pieces highlighted. The cornucopia at her feet, right here, the huipil gown. Look at, you can see the warp and weft of the fabric. You can see the embroidered medallions on the fabric. This is an amazing work when you think about it. This is the macuahuitl. That's the Aztec sword. Those are obsidian blades, carry an edge that's over 1,000 times sharper than surgical steel. All right, pretty nasty piece of work, basically. There's the bow, there's the quiver, and there are the fletched arrows within it. The feathered crown atop her head, the arrow unfletched on the metal here, but fletched on the coin with the Phrygian cap atop it, the nopal off to the left, and here is the pedestal upon which she's seated. A lot of these features much like the woman on the throne on the banknote that I presented about last time, okay? Let's look at the coins on which she appears, the San Luis Potosí coins. The motif appears on 8th and quarter real coins, state coppers, from San Luis Potosí between 1828 and 1862. In other words, from the wake of independence until the French intervention, right? And that's probably not an accident that these coins go out of, minting at that time, okay? And that's just a decade before the vignette originated. So they well could have served as a model, an inspiration for the vignette that I presented about last time. On the front, we see the same seated female figure, but with the legend Mexico Libre, or Free Mexico, arching overhead. On the reverse, there is a book of ley, or law, at lower center. It's in a laurel and oak wreath with a denomination at upper center, and around the margins, Estado Libre de San Luis Potosí, Free State of San Luis Potosí. So here are the obverse and the reverse of the quarter real coin. Here's the Mexico Libre. You can see all the features here. There's the Book of Law, the denomination, and Estado Libre de San Luis Potosí, and the oak and laurel wreath surrounding the Book of Law. If we take a closer look, we see our femme fatale here. This is a very good example, this one. You can actually see the warp and weft of the fabric on the coin, and also the embroidered medallions as well. And we zoom in a little bit closer, and you can make out those details even better here. But she's also present, as we've already seen, on the San Luis Potosí medal. It's a virtually identical image, decorates a proclamation medal issued in San Luis Potosí in 1828, the first year of the coins. The obverse is virtually identical, same seated female figure with legend Mexico Libre arching overhead. The reverse in this case doesn't have the Book of Law, surrounded by the oak and laurel leaf, but instead it has a legend at center that says, El Estado Libre de San Luis Potosí en memoria de los héroes de la patria, año 1828, the Free State of San Luis Potosí in memory of the heroes of the fatherland, year 1828. Above it appears a crossed arrow and macuahuitl, or Aztec sword, and at the base, a star. So here we see our familiar figure on the front, on the reverse, the crossed arrow and Aztec sword, the star, and then the legend in between. The back clearly explains to us the intent of this medal is to honor the heroes of independence. That may be important later on when I point out where I think this medal came from, what was the impetus driving it, basically. Again, a closer look at our lady here. It's really quite an impressive piece. It's also impressive because it's slightly larger than a quarter. So when you think proclamation medal, you think something big, right? Well, all this detail that you see there is rendered on something that's just a little bit larger than a quarter. So this is an impressive piece of artwork and minting that you're looking at, okay? And I actually have some examples with me, so if you want to take a look at this and the coin afterwards, I'm happy to show them to you. So let's take the image now and take it apart a little more closely. For one thing, it represents Mexico. The figure on the San Luis Potosí coins and medal clearly represents Mexico. All right, originally, the historian Orozco Ibarra identified her as an allegory of America back in 1869. But he pointed out she had an Aztec sword in her hand and a nopal or Mexican cactus that forms part of the national arms to the side. Those should have been a clue to him that she didn't just represent America. Those signal us that she represents what? Mexico. Okay, so she may hint at America, but she is absolutely marked as a representation of Mexico by the Aztec sword, the nopal, the legend Mexico Libre, and the huipil gown, which is indigenous to Middle America, including Mexico. Right? So she's not a representation of just the Americas. She's a representation of Mexico. Again, the very word Mexico in the legend, the Mexican cactus from the seal of Mexico, the Aztec sword, the huipil gown, these are all things that are not related to other native or indigenous peoples in the Americas, but are uniquely related to Mexican indigenous peoples, in particular, the Aztec. So she's likely a representation of an Aztec woman. That's not too surprising because when Mexico used indigenous images to hint at national identity, they usually employed Aztec women to do that. Okay, so that would fall right in sort of the parameters of what we should expect. She's definitely native, okay? The figure is polyvalent, symbolizing multiple personas at the same time. It plainly depicts Mexico as a native woman, Mexica or Aztec. Mexica, by the way, which obviously the name Mexico comes from, was the Aztec word for themselves. They did not call themselves Aztec, they called themselves Mexica, okay? Aztec was a term that developed later and was applied to them long after, well, not long after, but after the Spanish conquest, basically. Again, the native features are her feathered crown. That's a native headdress. It labels her as indigenous. Also, perhaps as a noble or a royal, perhaps a princess or a queen. The arrow, that's a native weapon. Like I said, it's fletched on the coin, so it's clearly an arrow, and it is described as an arrow by the historian Orozco Iberra. Right? The quiver, it's a native weapon, full of arrows. The bow, a native weapon. The macuahuitl, an Aztec sword. The huipil, an indigenous gown. So all of these different features tell us that she's not just any woman representing Mexico, she's a native woman representing Mexico, and almost certainly a Mexica or Aztec woman representing Mexico. But in addition, on this representation, she also stands for something else, yet a third persona, all right? Not just Mexico, not just a native woman, but also liberty, okay? In the case of the San Luis Potosí coins and metal, the figure also portrays liberty. Issued in the wake of independence, it celebrates Mexico's newfound liberty. It's accompanied by the legend Mexico Libre, free liberty. It clutches or presents even and gazes upon the Phrygian cap of liberty, right? A classical old world symbol of liberty. It features a woman seated on a pedestal, like seated liberty on other early Mexican coins, right? And draped in a gown, she bears arms like seated liberty and is associated with the Book of Laws, also similar to seated liberty, right? So the other half of our legend is Libre, obviously related to liberty. She has these features here that are associated with her independence, if you will, and she has almost like she's handing it, and if you look at her eyes, she's gazing on it, the Phrygian cap of liberty. So she is therefore not just Mexico, not just a native woman, she is also liberty at the same time. They have conflated all of these persona in one figure, which is pretty friggin' cool. That's an incredibly powerful allegory that we're looking at right here, given the symbolism of post-independence Mexico. All right? Here we see one of those seated liberty coins. For those of you who are unfamiliar, she's wearing a gown. Well, I'll just go ahead, actually. I've got it labeled right here. She's wearing a gown. It says Libertad, liberty, right here. She has a weapon. She's a defender of liberty, just like our other figure has native weapons, right? She's resting her arm on the book that says Ley on it, just like the book of law that's on the reverse of the coins, all right? She also has the fasces of leadership, and she's seated atop a pedestal. So structurally, they have replicated in the image of her liberty. All right, so it's not just the symbols that are attached to her in the image, it's the entire arrangement. The configuration says liberty in the terms of that time, okay? Now, how does this get used over time? Let's take a look, because it turns out that these coins and the metal, they're not the only usage of this image. It goes back quite a way and has a very deep, rich history. We'll begin with this metal from the Iturbide era. Our 1828 figure builds on a series of images on prior metals, most immediately in 1821. On the obverse, we have the same native Mexico. This time she's standing, half profile at left, with a plumed crown, quiver, bow, and huipil, with embroidered eagles on it, by the way. You can actually look at it really closely under a loupe, and you can actually see the embroidery on her gown is eagles. All right, very Mexican of them. She's handing a sword, a laurel crown, and ribbons to Iturbide under a radiant cloud containing a chalice, cross, sprigs of grapes and wheat, and a Latin legend at the margins that promotes liberty and country. Okay, on the reverse, we've got a Mexican eagle with a snake in the beak, grasping a banner in its claws with a Latin legend praising Iturbide. So here we see the front, and here we see the back. As we get closer to the front, you can see the standing figure. This time she's not seated on a pedestal, but she's got all of the, the features that we just identified on the other figure, including the embroidered gown. See the little eagles on her ground? She's wearing a huipil. She's got her feathered headdress, right? She's got a bow, an arrow, a quiver full of arrows on her back, okay? A whole bunch of the features we just saw are here. So this is our figure, but she's not standing up, all right? I mean, she's not sitting down, she's standing up, all right? So we do have antecedents for those San Luis Potosi images, all right? That's not the only one. We also have several medals from Fernando VII, Ferdinand VII, okay? Native Mexico was also employed before independence. So the same image was used after independence and before independence, but in very different ways, as you'll see. Okay, as on an 1809 medal backing Ferdinand VII when captured by Napoleon. On the obverse, we have a profile right bust of Ferdinand surrounded by a Latin legend extolling his omnipotence and right to rule. On the reverse, we have our frontal standing native Mexico at right, with plume crown, quiver, bow, and huipil, cornucopia at her feet, and in this case, a chain binds her to a Minerva-like centurion personifying Spain at the left with a Spanish rabbit at its feet, okay? Below, we have in the ground the legend Fides Hispaniola and Fides Indias, basically fidelity of Spain and Indies. So here's our medal with Ferdinand VII on the front and our image of interest on the back. You can see the two legends below, and you can see the centurion-like Minerva on the front. There's the Spanish rabbit. That's been used on coins since Roman times to symbolize Spain. When you see a rabbit, it's telling you that figure is Spain, okay? And here is our woman right there, okay? What do you notice about her connection to Spain? She's chained to Spain. She is not a symbol of Mexican liberty here. She's a symbol of the subordination of New Spain to Old Spain. Same image, two very different uses. Mike.
I don't want to interrupt as well here, Doc, but she's not, the chain's not around her neck.
No.
Around her feet, she's holding it.
She's holding it. Yeah.
It looks like she's voluntarily holding it.
Yeah, so it's kind of walking a really nuanced line here. I'm glad you picked up on that. This is a Mexican medal.
She's not pictured as enslaved.
No, but there is a chain.
Fidelity,
So,
though, is a voluntary act.
right. So the engraver here has come up with a depiction, like I said, that walks a really fine line, recognizing her subordination to Spain, but suggesting, the way she holds the chain and through the legend down here, that she's kind of taken on this yoke on her own, sort of thing. And when you think about it, at the time, this Mexico is Spain. So are they going to get away with saying much more in terms of Mexican autonomy here? No way, right? So they've pushed it to the absolute limit. But it clearly tells us that she's being represented in a subordinated capacity, okay? Unlike what we saw on the previous material.
Yeah, can we think that probably what they're saying is, or picturing there is that there is a tie between
Yes.
both? I mean, not only
Yes.
the subordination,
Yes.
but that they are together, because I think in this moment, I mean, they are coming from a very strong period.
Absolutely. You got it right, okay? Part of the idea here is to show the connection between the two, because Fernando VII not only toppled his father from the throne just 2 years before this, but the year before this, after he acceded to the throne, was taken captive by Napoleon. That was being held in a prison in Spain, or in France. And Napoleon put his brother as ruler of Spain, basically at this time. So what they're saying here in Mexico is that kind of together we can get beyond the French intervention, not in Mexico as we're used to with Maximilian, but the French intervention in Spain itself. Now, that's really what opened the door to a lot of the independence movements in Latin America, was the fact that the Spanish crown was in a crisis from 1808 to the mid-18 teens, basically. Yes?
Sorry if I'm getting ahead of you. Do we know what the pattern on the gown?
I was wondering about that. That's
Yeah.
like Eagles.
Yeah, some of them do, some of them don't. I haven't really got that sorted out yet, to be honest with you. All right, the pattern does vary a bit from one image to the next, so it's not identical from one image to the next.
I also kind of feel that the chain is a bit subversive because they want to show them bound together.
Right.
Very easily put in a rope rather than a chain. I think when we typically see chains in imagery, it is more of a submissive type of
Right.
symbolism.
Right.
They have to put the extra effort into this to engrave the chain rather than just a rope showing them bound together.
Right.
It also shows a stronger relationship.
Yeah, it shows a stronger relationship with the chain. Absolutely. I think all of your observations are correct. I think all of these things were intended by the artist. These people were incredibly skilled. They knew exactly what limits they were working with in terms of freedom of political expression, and they pushed it to the boundaries, and they employed all of these nuances. We have another medal from 1808, celebrating the Supreme Junta, that also has our young lady on it. So in 1808, Native Mexico was using a medal supporting the central junta that was installed in Ferdinand's absence while he was a prisoner in France. On the obverse, we have 3 junta members seated atop a Diaz with a Spanish legend. On the reverse, we have profile Native Mexico standing at left with plume, crown, quiver, wheatbill, Aztec sword, and flower garland in hands. Coin bags instead of a cornucopia at her feet, facing a Minerva centurion, Spain again, holding a lance, topped by a Phrygian cap, all right, and shield marking the individual as Ferdinand, and a Spanish legend at the top glorifying Ferdinand as the restorer of Europe. So here are our junta members on the front, but it's the reverse we're interested in. And we zoom in close, we see our figure right here, clearly the bow and arrows and quiver on her back, the feathered crown, our macuahuitl or Aztec sword in hand. She's wearing an embroidered huipil again. She has a laurel crown in her hand, money bags probably signifying the riches of Mexico at her feet, and also probably the riches that are to be enjoyed from maintaining the Union, okay, at least for Spain. And then here we have our Spanish figure, and what's really, two things that really jump out here are the sword with a cross, the hemispheres of the Spanish Empire, F.V11, Ferdinand VII. This is Ferdinand VII, dressed as Spain, okay? And the tower and the lion of the Spanish seal on here, okay? What's interesting is the Phrygian cap on the lance. Why would Spain be touting liberty here? Well, think about the context. It's 1808. What has just happened to him? The junta has been installed because he's been taken captive by Napoleon. So here the Phrygian cap doesn't refer to Mexico and its autonomy from Spain. It refers to Spain regaining its sovereignty from France, essentially. So the same images being used to send related, but subtly and importantly, different messages.
Interesting that the Ferdinand figure is standing on all weapons.
Oh yeah, all weaponry. In this case, the weaponry is modern weaponry, right? We got our chain here, by the way, as well, down at the feet.
Broken chain.
All right, broken chain in this
I
case.
don't think that figure is meant to be for it. It's very clearly female. There's no way Ferdinand would have tolerated being depicted as a crossdresser.
No, in the symbolism of that time, he wouldn't have been being depicted as a crossdresser, but he would have been very accepting of being depicted as Spain. And since Spain was feminized, he gets feminized in this image, okay? So, and we see lots of images of Spain as a centurion and as a Minerva. sort of a reviving of the Roman and Greek goddess.
Meant to support Ferdinand, like you might wear a I like Ike button, rather than actually be Ferdinand.
Maybe, perhaps. Either way, clearly Ferdinand's being invoked here.
Yeah.
Okay.
The full legend that is.
The full legend, it says he's restaurador de la ropa,
It means
the restorer of
to
Europe.
the old time.
Right, exactly. Yep,
Restore.
right, precisely.
It's a very explicit.
They're very explicit, and it's about him.
Yep.
All right.
Perhaps could it be an image of a free Spain under Ferdinand?
That's what it's trying to invoke.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's how I would-
it's invoking the hope for a free Spain under Ferdinand.
Ferdinand himself
Absolutely
would
right.
never have tolerated a Phrygian cap on any of his symbols.
Well,
Well, but Ferdinand was in jail,
President.
so they did it for him.
There's a conflict there that hasn't been resolved.
No,
Well, and also remember the junta is leading to a liberal constitution.
Correct, in
which
1812.
Ferdinand kills when
Right.
he does get out and
Yep.
takes power again.
yep, absolutely right, Max. All right, we got another Fernando VII medal here. Native Mexico also graces an 1808 medal applauding Fernando VII's rise to the throne, following a coup and forced abdication of Charles IV. On the obverse, we have a half-profile bust of Ferdinand, which we've already seen. On the reverse, we have our seated native Mexico at left. She's seated once more, frontal, with plume, crown, huipil, Aztec sword, cornucopia at feet, her left hand resting on the arms of the city of Mexico, capped by a crown and flanked on right by the Mexican seal, with the eagle and snake atop an opal. Her indigenous arms, bow and full arrow at the bottom, or quiver at the bottom, and encircling a Spanish legend exalts his elevation to the throne. Okay, so we see Ferdinand on the front. We see our composition on the back that we're interested in. Here is our native Mexico, or I should say New Spain figure at this point, right? She is seated, hand resting on the seal here that happens to be the seal of Mexico City. And on opposite over here is the Mexican eagle and indigenous arms, quiver full of arrows, bow, and our cornucopia over here on the left. And again, you can see that a little bit more closely if we zoom in, all topped by a crown, suggesting subservience to the Spanish crown here, essentially. So, and oh, by the way, you also see her macuahuitl, or Aztec sword, over here in her right hand, okay? So once again, a very deft navigation of the subjugation of Mexico in this representation. The whole business begins with a medal celebrating Prince Charles, okay? So native Mexico appears for the first time on a coiner medal, on a 1780 medal saluting the birth of Prince Charles, son of Charles III. On the obverse, we have profile bust of Charles III at left, facing his children at right. On the reverse, we have a profile kneeling native Mexico at right with plume, crown, bow, quiver, huipil, cornucopia at feet, before a shield of Mexican eagle under a star and crown, receiving the baby Prince Charles from Minerva, Spain, with a Spanish rabbit at her feet, before the shield bearing the arms of Mexico, with an encircling Spanish legend referring to the birth. So here's the obverse with Charles III and the children here. Here's the reverse that we'll zoom in on. You can see the legend around here, basically celebrating the birth of the child. And here we have Minerva centurion representing Spain, standing before a pedestal, a little altar smoking, and a shield, and that actually has the tower and the lion of the Spanish seal on it. And just in case you didn't know that she was Spain, what do we have here? A rabbit, marking her as Spain. Kneeling before her, receiving the infant Charles, we have native Mexico. And this is her first appearance on a coin or a medal in 1780. You see her bow, you see her quiver full of arrows, you see her plumed crown, you see the cornucopia, you can even see the embroidered huipil that she's wearing. This is the same woman. And she stands before a medallion or a shield that has a crown, a star, an eagle with a snake in its beak, seated atop what? A nopal cactus. All right, clearly labeling her as an allegory for Mexico. or an avatar for Mexico, as I've used the word here, right? Interestingly, we can learn something about her position in Mexican art from the engravers, because most of those medals are signed. So we know who engraved them. So most of the native Mexican medals are signed, identifying the artist responsible for them. The 1828 San Luis Potosí medal, like the coins, was not signed, but as we've noticed, it was extremely well executed. The 1821 Iturbide medal was engraved by Jose Guerrero. The 1809 and 1808 Ferdinand VII medals were produced by Francisco Gordillo. The 1808 Junta medal was prepared by Tomás Surya. And the 1780 Prince Charles medal, an original native Mexico, were created by Jerónimo Antonio Gil. Most of these individuals were the chief engravers at the Mexican Mint. Okay? So these are major figures in Mexican art. I want to focus for a moment on this last one. Here is Jerónimo Antonio Gil. He was not only the chief engraver of the Mint, he was the founder of the Academia de San Carlos, which is the Academy of Fine Arts of Mexico, which has produced most of the great artists and art of Mexico for over 2 centuries. So what the fact that she on coins and medals is a product of the mind of this man tells us something really important about her. She comes from the guy who was at the center of the art universe in Mexico in his day. So how important is her figure? It's really important. It was embraced by the leading lights of Mexican art of this time, including Jerónimo Antonio Gil. All right, this is a really significant figure we're talking about here, okay? We also have related images that appear on other pre-independence medals that are associated with native Mexico, but not native Mexico. Between 1812 and 1814, we have several medals that hail Ferdinand VII's restoration to the throne when Napoleon finally released him, and then he came back and turned out to be not much of a king, okay, lost the Americas in the process, okay? And the new Spanish Constitution that Max referred to from 1812 a little while ago that started to at least try to give Spain and the Spanish people some place in their monarchy, right? Well, on these medals, we see a male Native American figure on the reverse at right with typical indigenous signs, as I'll show you in a moment, but he's lacking the Mexican markers. In other words, of course, he's not wearing a huipil. That would be cross-dressing, okay? And he doesn't have the macuahuitl or Aztec sword. So the fact that he's lacking the Mexican markers tells us that he's not signifying Mexico, he's signifying Spanish Americas, basically. I'll show you in a moment. We also have a 1789 proclamation medal from proclaims Charles IV's ascent to the throne. It doesn't show the figure, but it shows the arms. So the same concept is in part being represented now through the arms that mark and distinguish her. So they've kind of dropped her, but they kept the markers that tell us who she is. All right, so here's an example of one of those 1812 to 1814 medals. You see the 2 hemispheres of Spain. You see a Minerva centurion over here. We don't have a rabbit in this case. We got one of the lions of the Spanish seal right next to the individual. Okay, we do have the Spanish seal at center with the crown at top, and our native figure on right, cornucopia at feet, huge longbow in left hand, the strap leading to a quiver full of arrows behind him, and a feathered crown on top. So he doesn't have any distinctly Mexican signs on him, though. So I interpret this as an indication of the Americas and not as an indication of Mexico. If he were meant to represent Mexico, he would probably have all those Mexican features associated with him. But we've also seen Mexico is represented as a what? Not as a male, as a woman.
On the other ones.
Yeah, the other ones. So Mexico is represented as a woman. The fact that he's being shown as a male suggests that he's something different. In this case, probably the Americas. Here's that 1789 medal, okay? And you'll notice we've got the Mexican eagle basically here. We have the seal of Mexico under the crown. And look below the eagle. There's our bow. There's arrows, the fletchings. There's our macuahuitl, the Aztec sword. There's our quiver full of arrows. Many of you have probably seen these same symbols on other Mexican coins. Can you think of some examples?
They're copper nickel 2 centavos.
Right. How about those insurgent coins? The same weapons are depicted on the insurgent coins. All right. Those were a lot of the weapons that were used in the War of Independence, but they also symbolized Mexico, and they symbolized native Mexico. So I think this gives us a key to help understand some of the imagery that we see on other coins and metals as well, by deciphering, by decoding what we see here. We also have some other prior native Mexican depictions that aren't on coins. Let's take a look at how what we have on coins and metals stands up against depictions in other media. So the examples examined here echo earlier uses of native Mexico in other media. In 1660, we have her standing at right in Ortiz's thesis for the Viceroy of New Spain, wearing her huipil, a mitre-like Aztec crown, or xihuitzoli, but no indigenous weapons. In 1770, we have her seated again in Lorenzana's Letters of Cortés, wearing a pedestrian crown and surrounded by indigenous Mexican weapons and other native symbols. And in 1770, we have her seated opposite Moctezuma II, in an anonymous allegory of the Spanish monarchy and kingdoms of Mexico and Peru. So here's that Ortiz thesis from 1670. Here she is. Huipil, Aztec xihuitzoli, instead of the feathered crown in this case, opposite a centurion Minerva, Spain, right? And in the middle, we have the bi-hemispheres, one occupied by the seal of Spain, the other by Mexico, all beneath a crown right here. In other words, this is almost the exact same program that's on some of those metals, only it's over 100 years earlier. So what does it tell us? Are these metals inventing something new, or are they giving a new voice through a new medium, to the same visual language, if you will? I think they're giving a new medium of expression to these images. Here's one from just a little before the Charles III, the Prince's medal. Here we have our seated figure. She's wearing the xihuitzoli again, this time with flowers on it, so it's a little bit of both. There's our macuahuitl. There's our quiver full of arrows, right? I mean, the bottom line is you start looking around here and picking this apart, it's full of indigenous weapons. What do we have here? We've got our eagle, okay, with the seal of Mexico City on the eagle, right? This is a completely different medium. So artists all over Mexico are using these same images. Our metals are part of something much bigger than just the metals, and so are the coins, okay? Here's that anonymous allegory, also from about 1770. It shows Spain as a woman in the background here, suckling Mexico and Peru. And as we come closer, we see a Moctezuma figure here. This one happens to be almost copied from the Moctezuma that I lectured about here some years back, okay? And over here, who do we have? Feathered headdress. What's she have resting right here? That's the Aztec sword, the macuahuitl, labeling her as our native Mexico figure right there. We've got a bow right next to her. So if we look closely, we find all the identifying images. We also have use of native Mexico on coins and metals from the era of the coins and metals we've been looking at here. So in 1822, we have a painting by Jose Ignacio Paz, his coronation of Iturbide, with Iturbide being co-crowned by a standing native Mexico at left in a huipil and holding an Aztec sword. About the same time, this is my personal favorite, we have an anonymous bust of Iturbide's wife dressed as native Mexico with a tricolored plume crown and the cornucopia. And in 1834, we have an anonymous allegory of a seated Mexican liberty, almost identical structurally to our coin and metal, crowned with laurels by Hidalgo, lofting the Phrygian cap atop an arrow, and flanked by Iturbide. This is Paz's coronation of Iturbide, the painting. Let's zoom in a little bit closer here, and when we do, look who is on his right. It's native Mexico. She's wearing her huipil, right? What does she have in her hand? The Aztec sword. And what's she doing?
Holding your crown.
She's holding a crown and placing it on the top of the head of Iturbide. So is she a very important figure in Mexican art? She's a hugely important figure in Mexican art.
Who's the guy with the club?
That's a really interesting question. I suspect he's there to represent the Chichimecas. The Chichimec were the ancestors of the Aztec, all right? And they considered the Chichimec to be sort of desert barbarians. Yes?
Would it not be Heracles?
Yes.
Is the club?
Could be as well. And what I would say to you is it's probably all of these. Because most of these figures, as we've seen thus far, she often doesn't represent just one thing. She represents 2 or 3 things. Why not 2 or more things over here as well?
The lion,
Yeah,
that goes way back.
right. But in a Mexican context, he's exactly as they describe Chichimecs. So you're probably looking at a conflation of the 2 over here. That would be my guess. All right, but very good question. Thanks for asking it. Okay, here's my favorite. This is the Empress Ana Maria Huarte de Iturbide. It's an anonymous allegory. Check her out. Plumed headdress. What are the colors of the feathers?
Green, white.
Green, red, and white. Seen those before? How about the Mexican flag?
It's also the 3 guarantees.
Correct. That's right. The 3 guarantees of Iturbide.
And her sash is the same color.
Her sash is the same color. She's wearing a quiver with arrows in it. She has the cornucopia down here. She's presenting herself as Mexico, as adopting the persona of native Mexico in this image. How important then was this image to Iturbide and to the early crown of Mexico? Clearly very important, okay?
Peter, you probably noticed on your prior slide,
Mm-hmm.
3 guarantees show up on the left there as well.
Yep, absolutely. Yep. So, I mean, these things are rich in allegory. I mean, they're just full of allegory. You can literally spend hours looking at these things. And you know what? I look at some of them a dozen times, and the 13th time I see something new that I didn't see before. You know, because they're so rich, just laden with this imagery. All right. And then this one.
That one, well, is that like a skeleton hand there, or?
You know, that's interesting. I don't know. I'm wondering about that. Okay.
The right hand?
It sure looks like that, but I don't know.
Or a tiara there?
I mean, that's one thing I haven't figured out
It
yet.
might be something she's holding.
It does look like something she's holding,
Handkerchief or something.
you know, but I don't know. I'm not sure what it is. You know, maybe that's something, you know, last time I was here and I gave a presentation, I got a pretty good idea that led me in some good directions, as you're seeing now. Maybe some of you will have some ideas about that piece too. And then this one here is spectacular because here's the pedestal. She's seated on it. She's wearing a huipil. She's got a feathered crown. Once again, the tricolors, okay? Quiver on her back. If we look to the side, there's our macuahuitl over here. She's got a fletched arrow in her hand with the Phrygian cap of liberty on it. This is almost identical to what's on the San Luis Potosi coins and metal right here, okay? Oh, and she's being crowned by Hidalgo. And look who's broken the chain of bondage to Spain. Iturbide. All right, these are just really cool pieces of art, absolutely pregnant with meaning. All right, so in retrospect, I've come to sort of coin a name for her, all right, so to speak, pun intended. I call her Tia Mexica, right? The native Mexico figure is clearly an indigenous avatar representing Mexicanness. She's a lot like Uncle Sam. In a lot of ways, she resembles Uncle Sam, a single character intended to stand for the U.S., U.S. identity, the U.S. people, and U.S. sovereignty. Okay? I call her Tia Mexica. In this case, she symbolizes Mexico, Mexican identity, the Mexican people, and Mexican autonomy, a sort of Tia Mexica, or in English, anti-Aztec, basically. Okay? So that's my fond name for her because I've become very fond of her through all this research. So not quite the scowl that Uncle Sam has on here in the famous flag painting, right? But a very royal presence representing Mexico, Tia Mexica or anti-Aztec, all right? She also appears to be associated with independence festivities. The appearance of Native Mexican liberty on the San Luis Potosi coins and medals likely originated in the independence commemorations as chronicled by Salazar Mendoza. During the 1820s, San Luis Potosi launched a series of annual festivals to celebrate independence and its heroes. Of course, what does the back of the medal tell us? It's about the heroes of independence, right? While organizing the 1827 festivities, the minting of coins commemorating independence was proposed. So what do we have in 1828? Coins and a medal, all right? Almost undoubtedly developing out of this conversation here. Celebrating independence and its heroes, probably associated with the ceremonies of independence. So these coins and this medal may in fact have been released at the independence ceremonies. These medals may have been distributed to the survivors, the veterans, okay, of the War of Independence in San Luis Potosi at the time, all right? So they may be associated with independence ceremonies back at that time. They also might have another rather interesting association with a procession. The San Luis Potosi figure may have been brought to life in a local religious procession. In 1865, there's an engraving in Le Monde Illustré, the French journal, right, graphical journal, that presents a similar female native figure marching in a procession involving the Church of Our Lady of Carmen in San Luis Potosi, possibly projecting Mexican identity and liberty in the face of French occupation. We'll take a look at it in just a moment. In 2017, the Church of Our Lady of Carmen still exists. A procession continues to be held, and an important component of the procession is troops of native dancers participating. So in other words, this tradition might still be what? Alive. So here is our illustration from Le Monde Illustré from 1865. Here's our native figure with her crown. All right, we can see the quiver with arrows behind. She's wearing, it's not necessarily a huipil here, but it's definitely traditional native garb. She's in this procession with musicians. It's a religious procession we see as well. I call your attention to the date, 1865, because we know this figure by this point in time doesn't represent Mexican subservience to Spain. What does it represent? Freedom and independence. Mexican freedom and independence. She's marching pretty damn boldly during the Maximilian regime. So this may have been a very subtle way of the people of San Luis Potosi of thumbing their noses at Maximilian and the French occupation, right? The French were clearly there. It's in a French journal. But they didn't pick up on the symbolism that Mexicans would have picked up on.
Well, not all Mexicans opposed the French occupation.
Not all of them did, but many of them did. Okay, and as we know, ultimately, it doesn't end well for Maximilian or the French in this particular endeavor. Okay, so here's our 2017 procession, and what do we have dancing in the procession? Native figures, again, perhaps a continuation of the very sort of thing. This is the procession of the Templo de Carmen, all right?
Those folkloric troops are all over Mexico, even here in Southern California.
They are.
If you go to a mariachi festival or something like that, you're going to see them.
They've become emblematic of Mexican identity, even to this day. And we see the emergence of that here on the coins and medals and everything. One last medal. The final medal to use a Native Mexico figure was released to honor the Mexican exhibitors in the Paris Exposition of 1889. On the obverse, we see a standing woman wearing huipil with plumed headdress, bearing quiver with arrows, produce, probably peppers, in her hands, surrounded by symbols of cultural, agricultural, and industrial progress, and a border from the Aztec Empire. She's over 100 years old now. In fact, if we go back to the original ones in the 1600s, she's several centuries old, and she looks it, all right, in this representation. On the reverse, we have an olive branch encircled by the middle ring of the Aztec calendar and explanatory legends. So here's the reverse with the olive, the middle ring, some explanatory legends. Here is the obverse with our standing figure, tri-lobed floral feathered crown, produce in the hands, quiver with arrows on the back, signs of agricultural, industrial, and commercial progress all around, basically. And this is the last major representation I find of her, certainly associated with numismatic or exonomic materials. All right, so what have we learned here? Well, there's a long tradition of personifying Mexico as a native woman, typically Aztec, based on garb and accoutrements. The practice extended from at least early in the colonial period, the 1600s, to the Porfiriato, the late 1800s. It appears to have been most pronounced in numismatic media from the late 1700s to mid-1800s. In colonial times, she was used to depict New Spain, frequently as a subject of Spain, underlining her subordination. On pre-independence medals, she was relegated to the reverse. She's always on the back. She's never on the front, okay, in pre-independence times. The obverse was always reserved for some theme involving Spain, the primary power. After independence, she was promoted to the obverse. So independence takes place, boom, she's on the front, okay, with the reverse occupied by other related Mexican themes. She's related to generic personifications of Native America, sometimes male, that lack Mexican ethnic markers. In the decades following independence, she was employed to portray Mexico, in general emphasizing her sovereignty. On coins and medals, she is sometimes conflated with native liberty, Phrygian cap in hand under a legend hailing freedom, evoking ceded liberty. She's commonly represented in association with native weapons as a warrior queen, defender of Mexican autonomy. Those weapons themselves become emblematic of Mexico and show up in other contexts as such. She's embraced under the Iturbide regime. She is shown crowning him, and his wife is depicted assuming her identity, which I think is an incredibly powerful visual statement. Similar to Uncle Sam in the US, she's an avatar for Mexico, Mexican identity, the Mexican people, and Mexican autonomy, a Tia Mexica or anti-Aztec. The San Luis Potosi version probably originated in conjunction with annual independence ceremonies celebrated in San Luis Potosi in the 1820s. She may have been portrayed in a religious procession in San Luis Potosi around 1865 to protest the French occupation, and she may also have served as the inspiration for the seated Mexica woman in the 1888 Banco Minero banknote vignette that started this whole thing, okay? A few last thanks I want to make. I in particular want to thank Jeff Stahl, who's seated right here. He's the guy who said when I gave my presentation last time, gee, Peter, you ought to take a look at some of these San Luis Potosi coins. Thanks, Jeff. You were right. I needed to take a look at those. Not only did it potentially provide the background for the note that I was analyzing, but it opened my eyes to a whole new figure in Mexican symbolism, Tia Mexica or anti-Aztec, essentially. So without your suggestion, I probably wouldn't be here doing this today. All right, so thank you very much. I also want to thank Corey and Max, who were very graciously provided me with images that I was able to use here. Also Rogelio Charteris and Luis Gomez Wuchner of the Sociedad Numismática de México, because as of August, I didn't have an image of the Iturbide medal. It's extremely rare. And Luis told me that he thought Rogelio had one. I got in touch with, I was in Mexico lecturing at the National Museum. I got in touch with Rogelio. He said, yeah, I got it. Come on over tomorrow. I'll let you borrow it. I borrowed it, took it to a professional photographer. It's in our lecture here today. So obviously this is a product of a lot of people's support and encouragement. And I want to very generously thank them all. Mike.
Could you speculate as to why she fell out of favor as a representation?
Could I speculate as to why she fell out of favor as a representation of Mexico? And I suppose I can. I'm not sure whether my speculations are really good or not. Other things came to represent Mexico more, all right? I think the seal began to take on a much greater prominence, not just in a numismatic arena, but in a lot of other areas, right? And so Mexican identity found itself expressed in a variety of different ways. On the banknotes, they used a ton of different things to symbolize Mexican identity. So they used Moctezuma, they used La Malinche, right? They used the Aztec calendar stone. So the bottom line is there was a proliferation of other symbols that began to occupy the symbolic space that she had held a lot of ground in before. And so I think they kind of pushed her out a little bit, or at least reduced her real estate, by occupying more of it. So that's my best read of the situation. I don't think anybody sat down and said, geez, I don't know, we need this babe to represent Mexico anymore. Okay, I think they were just actively exploiting other symbols to do the same thing, and she lost prominence in the bargain. okay? Other questions? I'm very happy to answer them.
Comment. You use images of proclamation medals, and as we know, many of those are super rare
Right.
because they weren't made in that great of quantity. But if you notice the artwork on them, it's just astounding.
It really is.
So they were, what I've read about them and what's been said about them is they were given to dignitaries, they were sent back to Spain to, you know, the king or his viceroys or, you know, really the
Right.
highest people got their hands on those proclamation medals. And to me, I get a connection like to Egyptian hieroglyphics where you have picture writing and that a lot of that stuff was only privy to the highest levels of people. So they would have a consensus of thought of what's going on. So, you know, this is how you rule. This is how you. This may be the problems that you're up against, obstacles. This is what's going on in the real world.
I think you're right on the money, all right? I didn't give you a theoretical background today because I knew I had a lot of empirical stuff to look at. But you might recall from some of my earlier presentations, I've talked about the concept of the imaginario. The imaginario is a suite of images that are assembled, essentially, to create or project an idea, oftentimes a persona or an identity, right? And so many times what happens is regimes will use multiple different kinds of media to project sort of the prevailing ideas of their regime, right? And they use different media to reach different people. So I think you're right in that these medals probably were a lot more accessible to the elites than they were to anybody else in the society. So this is part of a much bigger imaginario. Remember, we've seen these images are in other media, right? A lot of other media. So the numismatic and the metals, those materials are probably directed primarily at the elites. A lot of the other media, all right, including perhaps some of the coins, lower denomination, are being directed at other parts of the population, basically. But the idea of all is to create a field of images that everybody is surrounded in, essentially, that tells you what the principal ideas and themes of the time are, and so that you operate within those beliefs, that system of values, and everything. So I didn't talk about it here, but it's always a part of my work, all right? And what you just said is very, very consistent with that.
Peter,
Max?
as a follow-up to that, you talk about different medias. A number of these proclamation medals were done in gold, almost all of them silver and copper.
Right.
Some of them we know minages on, and they're like 5 in gold, a couple hundred in silver, maybe 1,000
Right.
in copper. So I think the media, the gold's clearly going to perhaps the king, perhaps a very important person, the silver probably to city dignitaries,
Right.
and then the copper I think were probably pretty available.
Maybe,
Yeah.
absolutely, maybe, you know. But again, it's all part of this imaginario. We don't have a really good word for it in English. It would be imaginary. But in English, that's an adjective, right? It doesn't refer to a collection of images. It refers to using your imagination. So that's why I use the Spanish version of it, imaginario, because we don't have anything really quite like it, you know, in English to use. But it helps to accommodate ideas like you and Jeff just had. They fit really, really well within that conceptual framework. Yeah. Other questions?
It might be interesting to review the use of female images in the 20th century of Mexican currency, specifically currency, because in the 20th century currency becomes more important than coins for iconography. So I'm thinking of La Gitana on the 5 peso note,
Sure.
and the woman on the
Sure.
1 peso note, with,
Right.
I forget, is she called Tijuana, I think?
No, she's a Tijuana,
Okay,
all right? So she's from Tehuantepec,
okay.
right? But nevertheless, a use of a woman and an ethnic association there because she's a very regional representation. So she's clearly referring to one part of Mexico. Yes?
Just a comment, I thought it was interesting that discontinuing this Aztec woman on the Mexican coins kind of roughly coincides with the U.S. rolling off the generic Lady Liberty of a lot of our coins.
Right.
So I just wonder if that's maybe just part of the modern era of less popular knowledge of like classical themes and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly enough, it does correspond in many ways with the American sequence too. If you go back to early American coins, in the time of the Revolution, right, you will find the United States and even individual states represented as a Native American woman. Okay, so clearly early in the first decades of the United States' existence, a Native woman was used to represent the United States. Through time, other things came to do that. She continued to be used like on Indian head pennies, the various gold pieces that have Native American, in fact, she's labeled Liberty on those in her headdress, right? The Buffalo nickel, for instance, has a Native American on it. Male this time, but bottom line is, all of these things are representing liberty and American liberty. Because the one thing that distinguishes Americans or Mexicans from their colonial overlords is their native heritage, right? And in the US, you're right, those have fallen on the wayside. And in the meantime, other symbols of US identity have come to occupy some of that symbolic space. So I do think some similar processes were at work. I was just talking with Gilles this morning from the ANS, the American Numismatic Society, about doing a presentation there on how native images were used on early coins in the US, Mexico, Costa Rica, and Colombia, because they all follow kind of the very similar trajectory, basically. This looks like a Pan-American phenomenon, all right? And it didn't matter whether your colonial master was Spain. It happened in the US with England. So it's very much an American phenomenon. I think these wider trends that you're pointing to are there and are worth taking a closer look at. Yeah.
There was also the concept, very popular in Europe at the time, of the noble savage.
Correct.
Which probably reached its peak in Jefferson's time and then kind of trailed off after that.
Yeah, I mean, it's always been there as an undercurrent, but you're right. Like many of the things we're talking about here today, they had their day, and they've kind of lost some of that ground, you know, over the years and even over the centuries. In fact, one of the things that Gilles and I were talking about this morning is the irony of this, okay? Both in Mexico and in the US, non-native people are using images of native people that they have exploited and oppressed to represent their national identities. When you stop and think about that, that takes a lot of chutzpah to do, basically, okay? I mean, you know, here in the US, we're exterminating Native Americans and we're putting them on our coins at the same time. We're appropriating their identity for our identity while we're trying to erase them from the landscape so that we can have their land. Somewhat similar things were going on in Mexico as well, you know? So there's a lot of really interesting levels to the symbolism and analysis here.
In the case of the Spanish, they thought they were doing the natives a favor by bringing Catholicism.
Correct.
Religion to
By bringing Catholicism, by bringing industry, by bringing, you know, a Western economy, you know, all of these things, they thought they were delivering Native Americans out of savagery and barbarism to civilization, despite the fact that the Aztec were a pretty complex society on their own. They didn't really need that help, you know.
I certainly didn't ask for it.
Yeah, they damn well didn't ask for it, that's for sure. Yes?
One of these images showed, I believe, the female figure on the left with a spear going down and what presumably was the dead bird on the bottom of it. And
Right.
I believe that was the one that was more indicative of the entire Latin area being under
Correct.
Spanish control.
Correct.
But what do you make of that? Is it killing Mexico or something?
No, I don't think it's Mexico at all. Remember what the time is. It's 1814,
Yeah,
right? Just 2 years before, Ferdinand has been released.
yeah.
So what I think you're looking at there is the death of French rule over Spain, essentially, that Spain and the Americas together have defeated the French symbolically on the coin and have triumphed and restored liberty.
An eagle, though.
Right,
So the French use the eagle.
They use the
This
eagle.
As well.
right,
That's it.
Or
they
a
do.
rooster.
Right, or a rooster, they use a rooster as well. Right, but the eagle is a eminently French symbol of French identity. So I think that's what you're looking at. You're looking at the death of the Napoleonic rule over Spain. All right, again, another metaphor, basically. Good question. I'm glad you asked it because I forgot to mention it when I was going over that piece.
Well, it was pretty obvious.
Right.
Somebody was sticking a spear in it.
Right, yeah, right. Any other questions?
All right, good stuff.
Great job.
Thank you very, very much. Appreciate it.